Hi everyone. I just wanted to introduce what I am going to do in my cooking video. It's not just any cooking video like you would see on Facebook scrolling through or TikTok or anything like that. What I am doing is very intentional, of course, and relates to the objectives of this course. Because as I was thinking about liberation theology, especially in Latin America, and what impacts it has and what relevancy it has for the rest of the world, I think that there's an important principle called cotidiano, which is like the daily life of people and how that lived experience can really shape and form one's narrative. So I am in a very privileged, very white context here in Winston and in my denomination and lots of other places. And I encounter people constantly who fall into one of two camps. They either live into their privilege without knowing what really it has an impact on in other places and people, and like the human cost of their privilege, right? Like what is actually behind their ability to just drive to Costco and pick up a pack of 30 toilet paper rolls, right? Like what is the human cost behind that economic system? What is the human cost behind that environmental system? And they just don't know. And that isn't necessarily entirely their fault. It's, systemic and what have you. But the greatest ability to change and to be changed by realizing your privilege, by realizing someone else's story is different but similar to yours, is just awareness. And the underbelly of privilege is great and terrible, and I could talk about it for hours. But what I think the other camp that people fall into, other than, I'm privileged and I don't really know what's bad about it, is the white guilt camp. And both camps equally frustrate me, to be quite honest with you, just because, it's one thing to walk around and live your life without realizing it, but then to realize it and just to be paralyzed by guilt and by sadness and by powerlessness. Like, I can do nothing, right? Like, I am only one person. It is so deeply frustrating to me as someone who leads with an Enneagram 8. It's like, no, you can do 85,000 things, and you can do so many more things than you realize because you have this privilege, because you have the resources and the time and the ability and the network to mobilize, to talk to people and work with and for people that have a different experience from you, but not in a bad way. We're not here to make value judgments on people's lives, because everybody has this inherent right to life and dignity in their own circumstances, whatever they might be. We can't choose our circumstances necessarily, so why would we pass judgment on them? So the cotidiano was really, really powerful for me to learn about and to kind of live into, because everybody has a lived experience, right? Regardless of your privilege, regardless of your social standing, you have a life, you have a story, you have a narrative, you have people that care about you and will work for you and that are on your team regardless of your economic standing. So I proposed and have really thought about how to present this kind of consciousness raising of others' narratives pastorally, because you have to recognize that there is a problem before you're able to see what's going on, to judge it, and then act on it, of course, in the liberation theology paradigm. So what I am going to do in this video, and when I take it out into the world, into my kind of pastoral life and context, once I'm done with law school, is to consciousness raise and to raise awareness about how your story and how the story of your family and the hardship that your family endured or is enduring, the obstacles that have been put in your way by whatever, have an ability to make you realize and make you aware of others and their narratives and their hardships and struggles. Because I have had the privilege of being around very different people in my life, whether that be politically different, religiously different, social standing different kind of thing. And what I have learned and the experience that I brought into this class and will take out of this class is that you have to have some sort of human dimension behind what you do. Policy proposals are great and helpful, and passing good policy and instituting it and enforcing it is incredibly important to the success of others and the success of human beings. But it's not any good if you don't have a human dimension. Like, people will not literally buy into whatever you're doing unless there's a human dimension, unless they can relate. I mean, they might like chip in a couple bucks or whatever, but that's not really buying into it. That's not really becoming passionate and understanding why you're doing what you're doing. Working in solidarity with people, which is what liberation theology is all about, I hope. So the only way to enter into this kind of communion, and it's very sacramental actually, to enter into this understanding, this deep, rich understanding of the other, is by creating a human dimension and really being intentional about living into that. So what I am going to do is cook a family recipe from my family. Actually, my aunt made this super in-depth little like collection of recipes. It's not even a little collection. It's literally hundreds of pages. It's unbelievable. But what's really cool about it is that inside there are recipes, of course. This is just a random page, main dishes with meat, actually. And it, of course, has the like recipe, and then it'll have like a little write-up about like the family history behind it, or where my aunt got this recipe, kind of just the history about it. And what's really special and important about that is that each story is so different and so very rich. It was from my dad's home ec class in the 70s, or from a neighbor when they lived in Minnesota. Like there are so many stories. And in this book, there's just this rich fabric of daily life. And my dad's side of the family, which compiled this book, didn't have a lot of money when my dad was young. My grandfather was a pastor, and my grandmother was a nurse. And they don't pay nurses as well as they do now, which is still not good enough. But they're, like pastors get paid like nothing still. So they didn't have enough money often to have super fancy meals. And they had 5 kids, including my dad. So there was just a lot of mouths to feed and a lot of resources. So they often made do with what they had. And I think that really speaks to not only lived experiences of others who are currently experiencing poverty for many different reasons, but also this time of quarantine and supply chain panic and not knowing, when you'll be able to buy rice again because everybody took it at Costco or wherever you buy your food. So what I am going to make is not, thank God, the Christmas Eve tradition of my family, which is a Norwegian dish called LALT. And it, I don't even know why it made it in this book, to be quite honest with you. But my grandfather's a pastor, so Christmas Eve service, big deal. And LALT was being made after all these services. And they ate at midnight. And it was disgusting. It is literally like potatoes that have been had the life and the dignity cooked out of them and put through this ricer, but it's not a ricer. It's automatic, and it makes all the starch come out. And it's really gross but cool. And then little tiny pieces of pork that are gross. Pork is fine, but like one pork chop for 7 people, that is all the pork that was in there. There's no salt, there's no seasoning. It's literally just pork and potatoes. I don't know why, but I will not make that for y'all because that is disgusting and nobody should ever have that again. That's why my, family, all of my dad's siblings, including my dad, did not become a pastor or a nurse, actually. So they're like, we are not having PALT ever again. Oh, thank you. So I actually have a very thorough cookie section in here, and everyone loves a good cookie. But these are like the most austere Minnesotan cookies that you could ever do. They are called angel cookies. I'll show y'all the recipe. So it is right down here in the cookie section. And the ingredients are like super plain. It's just like butter and 2 types of sugar, eggs and flour and vanilla and baking soda, so it rises. But that's it. They're called angel cookies. Again, not sure why, but the story behind these is that my great-grandmother Vogler, who's a very strong German woman, made these cookies in her Island Street kitchen in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, home of Line and Kugel beer, and also my grandmother, also the pride of Chippewa Falls. She turned 93 like 3 weeks ago, so it's very exciting. And literally, you make the cookie dough. It's like a super simple sugar cookie dough. And then you dip the cookie dough balls in ice water, and then you roll them in sugar. And that's it. So in this really simple recipe, you're connecting to tradition. You're connecting to generations of family. I never got to meet my grandma Vogler because she passed away when I was like 8 months old before we could make it up to Wisconsin. But she was an incredibly cool woman, and just the life that is present in these recipes and in these cookies, these super average, super plain cookies. They're not fancy at all. They don't even have frosting with them. You roll them in white sugar, and there's even a note here: if you want to be really fancy, you put food coloring in your sugar to make it fancy and exciting. So just in this really simple recipe, you connect to your ancestors, you connect to your family, which is incredibly important for Indigenous theology, which we also looked at in this class, and just ties to the land and how that all comes about in liberation theology, but also like working with, and what did my great-grandmother go through? What was her story? What was her life? And I'll tell you some more family stories that are really exciting, but people don't think about these things when they're cooking, right? It might come up occasionally, like, yeah, like my grandmother made this recipe and she was really cool, etc. But, like who are these people? What is their story? What is the human connection behind all of this? How can we work with and for people who, grew up in similar conditions to my grandmother and great-grandmother, who worked through incredibly challenging circumstances? And how can we really, see people for who they are and who God made them to be, so that we can work with them as people and not as charity cases, and not as, oh yeah, gosh, I feel so bad for, whoever, they're going through a really hard time right now. Like there's value in that, but there's greater value in recognizing their inherent dignity and working with them as people that God created. So anyway, this is a really long introduction, oofta, but enjoy this cooking video, and I hope that the insights that I have gleaned in this class really come through. Hi everybody, welcome to phase 1 of cooking. So I have 4 sticks of butter that have been softening for I don't know, like 5 hours now. Are they really soft? I don't know, but that's okay. So as I was thinking about this recipe and the way that it has just been passed down to my family over the years and how on earth that connects to liberation theology, I really am thinking about the power of narrative and the power of stories and how God works in that kind of human dimension of narrative and story. My hands are gonna get so gross. Because like, how did Jesus show up in the world, right? Not as some magical person necessarily with all this like razzle and dazzle and, you know, ha, I can heal you, amazing, let's do it, get in line. But more like a person who showed up as a human being, right? Was born to 2 parents, with, you know, some weirdness thrown in, of course. Nothing can ever be super normal, right? But, you know, lived a normal life, had some, like, weird moments of going to the temple and, like, showing up everybody, but it happens. And he was a human that had human needs and human urges and yelled at people and flipped over tables when he got pissed. And so often with, like, charity and with, working with other people and for them, not necessarily with them, but for them, you get this idea of the person being somehow less than or different from you in some groundbreaking, life-altering way. Like, oh yeah, like they have this situation or that situation, but the reality is, like, they're still people. They still have human urges and lives and things like that. So it's important to acknowledge that and to live into that. And I think Latin American liberation theology really highlights that. Like, we're all human. We all have this inherent dignity. And to diminish that or to otherwise package human existence as anything that's not this idea of dignity and solidarity is just not okay. It's, like, completely unacceptable. So what I'm doing now is I am hopefully going to measure out a cup of both white and brown sugar and pack it in. Don't know where my cup measure went, so we're going to kick it with a half cup. Also, I'm doubling this recipe because my aunt's notes say it's small. You'll probably want to double it, referring to the recipe. So here we are. Haven't ever made it in my life before, but we are going to double it because that is just the kind of game we want to play right now. So who knows how it'll turn out, and I will probably be making cookie dough for the rest of my life, but it'll be fun. It'll be entertaining. And I'm just dumping. I cleaned my kitchen for this video, even if you may not be able to tell. And I definitely just dumped some sugar on my counter, so it's fine. We're doing great. Okay. So also, when I'm thinking about, like, the lived experience and narrative present in cooking, I think of, whose stories are these by and large? I mean, my dad was an amazing chef and baker. He was actually a better baker probably than he was a chef, and he passed away my senior year of high school. But for my parents' first date, he made my mom a cheesecake from scratch and frozen pizza. So it's like, well, all right, this is interesting. This is the kind of stories that need to be told. Yep, definitely just dumping sugar on the countertop now. So, in these recipes, there's women's stories just like embedded throughout, right? It's my grandma who found this recipe from the backdoor neighbor in their neighborhood in South Dakota. There's, stories from my aunts. My dad had 3 sisters. One of them wrote this cookbook, and the others were like editors, basically. And each of them have stories and lived experience that is different from mine, but also like similar, right? So when we're thinking about stories and narratives in the context of the Christian faith and in Latin American liberation theology, the human dimension is what really links us all together, that really connects us to our Creator, our Redeemer in the person of Jesus, and our Sustainer in the Holy Spirit. So I think to shortchange that and to be like, what does cooking have to do with anything? Like, this is weird. We're missing a human dimension that is present in stories, and I think is so often ignored by people. Like, they're not sitting around the fireplace anymore and talking about, tell me about grandma or grandpa in the war, right? Like, there's a human dimension of stories, of cooking, of being together, of making something out of nothing that we miss. But in this time of quarantine, it's been really, really interesting to see how cookbooks have really taken off, especially like family cookbooks and church cookbooks. I don't know about y'all, but like there's a really interesting Midwestern kind of kick with church cookbooks, also in the South too, I guess. So like people will just, like women's groups or whatever will get together and make little cookbooks. But they've been coming back with a vengeance, because what else are people going to do in this time? There's no more yeast in the grocery stores because it's all sold out. So I just realized that I don't have white sugar. Okay, I'm back for the second time. We had some technical difficulties with the first take, but it's okay because I didn't add any sugar. So I have my 10-pound bag of sugar right here. And we're going to measure out a cup of granulated sugar too. It's also interesting to look at these like antiquated recipes and see like the vestiges of white supremacy within them. Not that that's something I super consciously think about in terms of like cooking, but like this is white sugar. What does that have to do with anything? It just, like, that's rude. We don't talk about sugar like that. It's just sugar. There's like dark brown sugar, light brown sugar, but that's about it's fine. So, all right, I am going to now cream this. Looks a little something like this. It's just a lot of butter. A lot of butter. And do you have the sugar? So I will do that so that it doesn't like make a lot of noise, and then I will get back. See you soon. All good. So I beat all the sugars and the butter together. Looks a little something like this. Tastes good too. Already taste tested it because, quality control. So the next step here is to add 2 eggs. Here. So my family is predominantly from the Midwest. And so I'm a very kind of dairy heavy culture. And so there's gonna be a lot of butter in here. My grandma, born and raised in Wisconsin, so that's like the dairy capital of the United States. Ugh. Truly, if anything, this video has shown me great solidarity with those who host cooking shows, because I don't know how they do it. This is a lot of work. Huh. Okay, we unbroke the yolk. Hope there's no shell in there. Okay, so I'm gonna just beat this in. So back to the lived experiences of women. So I mentioned in the intro that I didn't know really my great-grandmother other than through stories because she passed away before I was born. But her stories are really, really cool. She's a cool lady. So she had a sister named Aunt Vilma. Well, her real first name wasn't Aunt, but she's my Aunt Vilma, great Aunt Vilma. And she was a nurse for her entire career. And she worked in World War II for the Red Cross as a travel nurse. And she was in the first wave of soldiers to come on the beaches in Normandy for D-Day. Like, what? That is such a cool story. Wouldn't get told if I didn't make these cookies. Just kidding. My grandma tells it a lot. But, she ended up not being married or having kids ever, so my grandma kind of became like her surrogate child and really took care of her, especially in her final years. Bless her heart, she smoked like a chimney, so she got lung cancer and also died before I was born. But Aunt Vilma lived really close to my great-grandma and was consequently close to my grandma. And so keeping her legacy alive. She was a total badass, excuse my language. And also there's an unsubstantiated but definitely probably substantiated rumor that she hung out a lot with Dwight Eisenhower's number 2 aide de camp or whatever they called it back in those days. I'm not gonna say anything, but what? That is so cool. All right, so the eggs are in there. I didn't pre-measure anything, so you get to see how disastrous everything is together. But I think that's a greater metaphor for the messiness of human existence, or something like that. So it says to sift together the flour. We're not gonna do that because I don't strainers are irrelevant. I know why you would do that when you were in culinary school, but who has the time? So I'm gonna do this 8 times. I'm gonna see if I remember how many times I've done it so far. Don't worry, I have more flour. Alright, so I ran out of flour, but I got more. Don't worry. I'm trying to use the open bags first. Okay. It's 4 cups of flour. Yikes, it's all good. Okay. Baking soda. Let's see if I can find an open one. Who knows? Okay, there's an unopened one. I'm gonna go look in the pantry real fast. Baking soda. Don't worry, I found some. So when you're looking at history, and I was almost a history major in undergrad, so I have very little authority to speak on this, but the stories that you hear are men's. right? That's always a challenge with history, is that it's the men's story being told. So in this idea of doing a cooking class and to talk about the stories that are so present in the recipes and in your own narratives and in the narratives of your loved ones, you're bringing up stories of women and you're highlighting them. And I mean, even in the biblical narrative, like, how many stories are there of women? Like, a couple. And then a couple of those are like people getting, you know, horrible things done to them, or you know, not being portrayed in the best light. So it's like, let's talk about some positive female stories written for women by women. So then we have solidarity with women in different countries who are going through horrible things, or even in our own country. The statistics behind maternal health are just terrible. Why are women of color dying more and at greater rates and of way preventable things than white women? Right? Like, consciousness raising, folks. Like, let's make this a thing. Let's make it happen. Let's speak to the stories and narratives of women and why they are ignored and how we can no longer ignore them and sit idly by as people die for reasons that can be prevented. Shoot. This is cream of tartar. It's like super powered baking soda and baking powder. And we are also going to have 2. This is half a teaspoon, but it always seems like so much more. Okay. This will make your pancakes really fluffy, FYI, if you ever are a big pancake person. You just put like a dash of this in there before you get going. Okay, all good. So, baking is also a really, baking in this very intentional way too, is a subversive act, because not only are you bringing up stories of women and of other folks who have been marginalized and put to the side by history, but you're also bringing it into focus, bringing history into focus in a non-imperialistic way. So I was really thinking about this last night, and I was like, wait, like, whenever I was in school and we talked about history and we talked about, you know, people and their ancestors and where they came from kind of thing, like, it wasn't fair to those people who didn't have access to those systems, who didn't have access to things like Ancestry.com or scrapbooks or, you know, even who their great-grandparents were. And I mean, this was like in the 2000s, so it wasn't like, you know, forever ago, or even, you know, earlier than that, where people legitimately did not know who their great-grandparents were because they died a long time ago. But, like, you know, we were supposed to make a list. This is in first grade. We were supposed to make a list of our great-grandparents and, like, their names and what country their family came from. And there were people in my class who, like, legitimately couldn't answer that question because they did not know. Because, I mean, that asks you to look even further back than your great-grandparents, because, you know, if they were all born in this country, not all of mine were, but if they were all born in this country, you know, where did their families come from? And people don't have answers to that necessarily, because they did not come to this country willfully. They did not come under their own volition. They were forced to come here by a capitalist system that did not see the value in them, but only for commodification. So, like, now there's stories that everyone has. It's kind of reestablishing a baseline for history and to share experiences in a way that doesn't discredit those who came to this country under circumstances that were out of their control, ultimately. Because because I'm thinking of people who were enslaved, like their family members and their descendants, and just like they don't have records dating back to the 1700s like my family does of their ancestors in Norway, and how cool that is, right? Like it is cool, and I won't diminish that because it took my aunt like forever to find all this stuff, but like some people don't have that opportunity, and it's through no fault of their own. So we should re-envision what it is to share stories and to tell stories and to be a part of the human experience in a way that is more fair and equal to everyone. Give everybody a fair chance at, telling stories and talking about their families in this really cool and powerful and extremely uplifting way that doesn't disenfranchise those who don't have 15th cousins in Norway that they keep in touch with. Okay, well, getting a phone call. It's fine. We're just going to be interrupted. We'll see what that is. I'll be right back. Sorry for that interruption. I have no idea who that was, and they didn't leave a message, so maybe you didn't even hear it on the video. Okay, so our last, oh my gosh, and they're calling me again. It's fine. They will just have to leave a message. Okay, it's all good. So the last ingredient is salt. Okay, now it's my least favorite part because I don't have a stand mixer, but I have strong arms and a need to work out. So now we combine them with just a spatula and intensity. So now I will do another time-lapse video because you don't need to see me try to do this for a very long time. Be right back. And so I ended up kneading the dough a little bit because it was being insubordinate, and this is what it looked like. So now we're supposed to let it chill out for an hour, literally chill. And part 2 is going to be super fun because we get the food coloring out, and it'll be really, really festive. So I'm just going to hang out and clean up a little bit, and then for the next part we can roll things in sugar and talk about differences and similarities in the human experience and how that also relates to the land. Catch y'all later. Alright, so we're back. I'm in a new outfit, and we are now ready for the best part, which is baking. So the oven is already preheated, and I'm using the butter wrappers from before because we only have like 10,000 of them to grease the pan. Hopefully the cookies don't stick. It's not like they don't have any butter in them anyway. And per the recipe's instructions, I made really cool colored sugar. Some people buy it. I chose not to do that and keep my frugal Midwestern roots. So I made 3 different colors of sugar, and I will show them to you when my hands are not covered in butter. Okay. Alright, so 3 different colors of sugar. I will show you a picture of those. There's like a really fun turquoise color, like a safety orange, and then like a really cool pink. So the dough has been hanging out in the oven, not in the oven, oh my gosh, in the fridge for an hour, and it's now hard as a rock. But that is how the best cookies are made. Okay, so we have the dough ball. I've taken all the plastic off. So when I was kneading the dough, and also when I was like thinking about what I would say in this video, the idea of the quotidiano, or like the average everyday life, really came up in talking about ecofeminist theology. And so I already talked about kind of the feminist angle and how the stories of women are highlighted in liberation theology, and how we can relate and raise our own consciousness in a meaningful way through that. And also what I'm doing right now is I am rolling the dough into balls, and you're supposed to dip them into water before you dip them into the sugar, but the sugar sticks just fine. I think because they've just been hanging out in the fridge for so long. But we'll see how it all works out. So maybe I will try dipping them in water. We're just making it all work. So I'm talking about like the eco part of ecofeminist theology is also tied to baking, because I mean, this is like ingredients from the earth. Oofda. And also I'm suffering from allergies, so this is just all coming to bear fruit at the same time. That is warm water. So in baking, you deal with very simple ingredients. So you deal with flour, eggs, sugar, and all those things come from the environment. So being able to really think intentionally about what you're doing and the systems that you're participating in, even when doing something as simple as baking cookies, is really can shape the way you frame daily life and daily practices to be more in tune and in solidarity with people with different lived experiences from you. So, for instance, like, you know, we're all thinking about our own health and safety during this time. But Native Americans in this country are dying of COVID-19 at alarmingly high rates. And what is being done about this? Very little. The deaths of Native Americans when they're on the reservation is not counted in the government's total of deaths. So whenever, you know, Anderson Cooper is like, well, it's a sad milestone today, we've passed so many deaths, it doesn't count the Native Americans. And I read the other day that the Navajo reservation has a higher infection rate than many U.S. states, except for like New York and New Jersey. So I'm just, you know, there are great injustices being done, and I'm a little more in tune to those because I got my undergrad degree in South Dakota, where there are quite a few Native American reservations. And coming from Texas, which is like a place that doesn't really pay any attention to Native Americans because there aren't as many as there are in South Dakota, it was, you know, heartbreaking and consciousness raising. And so now I am much more aware of whose land I'm on, and just the great injustices committed in that kind of frame, and how I can do better and be better with Native Americans. And I'm going to date myself a lot by saying this, but I saw a TikTok the other day that was about, that was done by a Native American, and he was talking about how, you know, all this stuff was going on the Navajo reservation, and no one was paying any attention. So I donated to a fund that he linked in his TikTok, and I apparently was not the only one, because it raised like $2 million, which I know is nothing compared to the great systemic injustices. But I mean, being aware that there is a problem, because often we are so self-absorbed in our own needs and in our family's needs that we forget that there are other people in the world. So just another kind of emphasis created by really intentionally thinking about the stories that are behind baking what we're actually doing. Because like this is like refined flour, and I used Lowe's flour, so it's from North Carolina, which is really cool. It's milled in the Carolinas. It may not be from North Carolina. I read it better. But you know, there's just like so much to be aware of. And ultimately, my goal is to not necessarily shame anybody, because, like I said in the introduction, I am very aware that a response to this kind of consciousness and awareness raising is white guilt, which I'm like, well, that's not very helpful to anybody. But it is a valid response. I'm not going to take away anybody's feelings, but like, it's not the most helpful. So, in terms of working with and for people whose lived experiences are different from ours, and also like lands different from ours, and honestly just a more general way of life that is different from ours, it's important to be aware that we by ourselves are not able to solve all the world's problems. My grandma, who I have talked about extensively in this video, always tells me, Hannah, you can't solve all the world's problems. And I'm like, Grandma, I will try. But you know, she's been around the block a couple times, so she knows that it isn't necessarily possible to solve all the world's problems. I keep stepping on the same ball of dough that I dropped, and I really don't want to have to like scrape it off the ground. Okay, so you can't solve all the world's problems, and like that's a huge bummer, especially when you're trained to see, to judge, and to act when you see a problem, when you notice a problem in the world. And so it's important to know that you can't solve all the world's problems, but you can begin to address them and begin to work for them using collective action. Right? So like in my work here, in my pastoral plan, I'm doing the first kind of step in the paradigm of See, Judge, Act. But the next step is to judge. So, you know, looking at challenges, looking at problems in our own communities and in communities around the world whose people have different experiences, different daily lives from us, but we can begin to relate and empathize with them in a sense of solidarity. We have to ask ourselves then, what does our faith say about this? What does our faith say about, you know, serving the neighbor, about being present with and for others? And because I'm Lutheran, cheated a little bit, because there's a lot to be said in Lutheran theology, especially about working with our neighbors, even if they have different experiences than us. So an important part of Lutheran theology is free and for others. We have been set free from sin to be there for our neighbor. And Martin Luther speaks about this in his treatise on the freedom of a Christian. So, like, you know, when people are like, yeah, I'm free from sin, it's like, but you also have a responsibility to care for the other. Like, that is your entire responsibility, actually. So, that is why Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, LIRS, is like one of the top 3 resettlers of refugees in the United States, which has dropped significantly since the current president took office, but doing great work on behalf of our neighbors, because that is what we are called to do as Christians. So I will finish making the rest of these, and I will show you the results afterward. All right, be back soon. So these are the final product of the angel cookies, and these are also the final product. I kind of took two different approaches with them by flattening them out beforehand and not flattening them out, so we'll see if they are done and if they're cooked. But I really hope this was a very helpful enough exercise on consciousness raising and the power of stories and narrative and everyday life in the context of baking.